We've got a great group here to talk about the issues on this first year anniversary of the white paper protests and the lifting of the zero COVID policy in China. And I want to start with you, Lynette. If you would please just get your take, look back, reflect upon the past year. I'd love to get your big takeaways as to what the protests meant, what has changed, what has not changed since a year ago, and how do those protests, as well as the lifting of the zero COVID policy, how do they continue to resonate in Chinese society today? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bates. And it's great to be here to share a virtual stage with Jude Blanchett and Yan Zhonghuang, both of my friends. So let me make 3 points on this first anniversary of the white paper protest. So in November last year, university students in several prestigious universities across major cities in China, they raised blank sheets of A4 paper in protest against the regime. And the protests were provoked by about 10 Uyghurs who died in the fire in Urumqi. Just before that, the fire engine couldn't reach the apartments, supposedly due to the COVID lockdown. And before these political protests took place in China, there were already hundreds of anti-COVID lockdown protests happening across the countries in second and third tier and fourth tier cities related to economic livelihood and so on. So people were complaining about income being disrupted by COVID lockdown. So it's important to remember that these white paper protests, they were not isolated incidents. They were built up of a bunch of protests that were going on for about 6 months or so throughout the countries with support from different income groups. So in particular, in the white paper protests, protesters were shouting slogans like Xi Jinping step down and down with the Chinese Communist Party, which you could imagine are pretty unprecedented and pose a direct challenge to the CCP. I would say the most direct challenge to the party in decades, not since June 4th of 1989. And soon after that, Xi Jinping abruptly abandoned the zero COVID policies, which he steadfastly imposed for 3 years. So you can see approximate relations between the two, right? So, it's difficult to say for sure whether the white paper protest had caused the party to abandon the zero COVID policies, because elite decision making in China is essentially a black box. But we can be fairly certain that, the protests have put a certain degree of pressure on the party to change its course. But the other thing to note is that, the white paper protests did not actually only take place in China. It also happened across other major cities in the world. University students from the Chinese diasporas gathered at their campuses, others at public square, and others outside of the Chinese embassies across the world to support the white paper protesters in China. So this time last year, as well as a couple of weeks ago, the first year anniversary of the white paper protest, the protests took place in about a dozen cities across the world, and for 2 years continuously. And for many of these young people who took part in the protests, these are university students in their 20s, right? This was the very first time they've ever taken part in a political protest. And if you look at some of the transcripts that has come out, look at the slogans that the protesters have chanted. They say, we don't want COVID protests. We don't want any COVID tests. We want freedom. We want dignity, unified with the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, and the Taiwanese. Now, their objectives may not necessarily align, but I think white paper protest is a bit of a political awakening for the younger generation in China, as well as what social movement scholars like myself would call, I think, a political opportunity to bring different stripes of anti-CCP elements together. And I think that is pretty remarkable. Because, since 1989, there has been no single event that would actually resonate with the majority of people in China. There has been crackdown and repression in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, but most of the time, the majority of Han Chinese do not actually resonate with the repression suffered by the fellow citizens. But white paper protests, because of COVID lockdown that everyone went through, that is an issue that could unite people across different income strata, different ethnic groups, and across different geographical regions. So I think most accurately, these are no longer protests because of the process that has happened across region, across different country borders, as well as sustained over a period of time. And until now, over 2 years, we should more accurately call it a movement, which should be differentiated from a protest because of its size and its sustainability. And I will leave it here for the time being.
Well, thanks very much, Lynette. I will want to follow up with you and get some further thoughts about this idea of a movement having formed vis-a-vis only, quote unquote, a protest. That's very, very interesting, and get your sense of how that's been sustained and how you continue to see it resonating. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the points you're raising are so critical. I mean, the sort of unprecedented nature of this in its criticism of the Chinese Communist Party, even of Xi Jinping himself, and that you note, this was not a small group of disgruntled individuals. This arose from a common experience from the top to the bottom of Chinese society. All in one way or another felt the effects, the ill effects of the lockdowns, and then also even the lifting of those zero COVID policies. So this begs the question, Jude. A year later, what is the standing then of the Chinese Communist Party in China today, and in particular, what about the position and power of Xi Jinping himself? Love to get your take on whether what we've seen over the last year. Are we seeing a new situation? Is there some risk for the party or for Xi?
Well, thanks, Bates, and it's really great to be here and to join Yanzhong and Lynette. Just really appreciated Lynette's opening remarks, and maybe to add to them, or at least try to support them a bit, is what I find very interesting about this is, at least there's a common perception amongst many that sort of politics is dead in China. The party under Xi Jinping controls everything. Civil society has been crushed, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that's true to a large extent. But as moments like the white paper protests demonstrate over and over again, politics very much survives, in the sense that the Chinese people have their own aspirations for what they consider to be a good life. They, within boundaries, strive to put pressure on the government to voice their concerns and try to get the government to focus its policy on the challenges that many Chinese face. Of course, the reaction to the white paper protests by the Communist Party also show that politics is constrained, and that the party still has pretty fearsome capabilities to be able to intervene and disable protest movements from really building momentum. But I'm struck by how surprising the events of 1 year ago were, and that if you would have rewinded maybe 2 or 3 weeks before they emerged, you would have thought it was impossible that we were about to see the beginning of a proto-nationwide movement that brought together various strata of classes and social backgrounds with a focused sense of grievance about policy. And I only raise that to say, I continue to feel very unsure about my own analytic judgments on China, because you continue to have these zigzags, which I don't hear many people predicting in advance, even if after the fact we all create a theory about, well, yes, it was obvious that the party was going to dismantle the COVID policies because they had to, because of variants. No one was making that prediction in advance. Second point, Bates, to your very good question is, the relationship between the party and popular legitimacy is pretty complex. And I think while we know what the major dials are, I'm not sure we always know what the right right settings on those are that supports the party. And it is invariably some mixture of performative legitimacy, historical ideological legitimacy, nationalist legitimacy. We're clearly seeing all of those under some degree of strain right now. Obviously, the economy is a decade on in the midst of a prolonged slowing down. Obviously, we're seeing rising disgruntlement, as Lynette mentioned, having rare, but still calls for Xi Jinping to step down is remarkable. And of course, China's geopolitical positioning is becoming, I think, far more complicated. So this gets to the question of where's the party and where's Xi Jinping? My operating assumption is, first of all, you can be unpopular and continue to run a country for a very long time in an autocratic system. So my bias is to think so long as we're seeing signals emerge that Xi Jinping is in control of the military, the security services, the propaganda apparatus, that to me is a proxy for his position administratively is still secure, even amidst rising grumbling, anecdotal conversations I'm sure we're all having with friends and colleagues back in China. I just get the sense that there's a growing feeling of malaise that is setting in as it appears that China is, for the first time in a very long time, somewhat directionless. And that the base assumption I think most Chinese had that all the problems we have in Chinese society aside, tomorrow will likely be better than today, or the opportunities for my kids or even my own forward movement in my career is optimistic. I think that's beginning to change a bit. But again, I think Xi Jinping remains firmly ensconced in power in terms of all of the publicly observable Leninist tools that he would need to control to keep his position. But I'll end on this, and this is another, I hope this doesn't sound epistemologically nihilistic, but autocratic systems appear very stable until suddenly they don't. And oftentimes we can only understand what the crack in the foundation was after the foundation begins to crumble. And I think now is a time less for coming to sweeping conclusions, many of which I hear in Washington about, peak China and China's about to go over a cliff and Xi Jinping may launch a diversionary war. To me, this is a time for big ears and big eyes. This is a time for really stopping and watching closely, because it's clear there's a great amount of churn and activity in China's political, economic, and social environment right now. I don't have a clear sense of what the direction of travel is because there's so many moving parts and spinning plates. But it's clear that a formula that allowed all of us external observers to feel like we had some degree of certainty, or at least we knew the sort of framework for Chinese decision-making and action. To me, at least, I'm no longer comfortable that I know what the framework is. So again, I don't want to just spend the whole panel discussion shrugging my shoulders and saying, I don't know. But in many profound ways, my honest answer to your question, Bates, is I have no idea.
Well, these are exciting times then, I would say, for all of us to be have these challenges in front of us and try to make sense of them. I like the idea of tuning in our ears and eyes a lot more sharply than we have in the past, and many of our past assumptions have to be deeply questioned. That in itself is a remarkable shift, a change that we are all trying to grapple with. Couldn't agree more. And now, Yan-Jung, I wanted to turn it over to you and get a little bit more deeply into some of the key elements of all of this. I mean, you're one of the world's leading experts on how the Chinese public health system works, what it means politically, what it means internationally. And I think it's really important for us as analysts not to lose sight of the fact that the white paper protest, while yes, having obvious political repercussions, arose out of a health crisis in China, which was manifested both in the severe lockdowns, which affected nearly everyone in the country, but also by its lifting, with some reports of perhaps 1 million unnecessary deaths following the lifting of those zero COVID policies. In other words, everybody from the most elite in the country to the least fortunate felt the effects of these last 3 years out of a health-related problem in the country. So I'd really like to get your thoughts on this. A year later, what are still the lingering health-related challenges? What has this whole experience exposed to the Chinese people and to the world about China's health system? And then what then are the social political ramifications of this in relation to the social contract, right, that the Chinese Communist Party has had with its people? I'd love to get your take on all of those questions, Yanjong.
Well, there's a lot to talk about here in terms of the implications for the Chinese healthcare system, and what that means for the Chinese political future. I think Lynette and Jude both have, examined some of those aspects. That if you look at that opening, right, December 2022, it was clearly, we know, right, that it was not a step-by-step, planned reopening, right? It was a clear sign that the system had reached its limit, right? Especially when we talk about highly transmissible, right, Omicron variant, even with, right, you have highly mobilizational state, which I think probably has the most extensive reach, right, compared with other countries. Still, but you cannot, right, contain the spread of the virus. Just to show the limit, right, of that system. I'm not just talking about, right, the political system, but the public health system too, right? It spent all this money, right, energy, right, resources on containing the virus. It was initially indeed sort of successful, right? Especially when you talk about first 1.5 years, right? They were able to break the domestic transmission chain, start quick economic and social recovery, but that was only before the arrival, the highly transmissible, first Delta variant, then the Omicron variant, the diminishing returns clearly became an issue and after, right, the fall 2021, right? But the thing is that you have that political system, that still, right, that refuse to make any changes, right? That despite this clear sign, right, that the social dissatisfaction, the economic slowdown, right? So there was, show that political system was this lack of responsiveness, right, to this coming disaster, right? Because if they were, right, they're able to listen to the advice of the experts. I mean, talking about, especially by the foreign media, right? Foreign experts, they will all say, well, this is not going to work, right? But in a clear way, what you learn from the Chinese state media and the government leaders that, this is, going to work. Our system is still better than others, right? So I think that indeed has, a clear impact on the legitimacy of the regime. We have already talked about that. The protest itself, right, is this clear indication, right, that this challenges, right, to the legitimacy of the system. But in the meantime, if you look at the aftermath effect, I think the challenge is also profound, right? If you talk about the economic slowdown, especially the government reliance on the delivering of economic growth, right now they could no longer claim, this rapid economic growth as one of the pillars, right, of this political legitimacy. So you would expect that in the future, very likely they have to look to other sources of legitimacy, right? That could be from populism, the pursuit of common prosperity, especially when we talk about China, you're already sort of falling into this, middle income trap, right? And then the nationalism, right? Which is we used to consider another pillar of legitimacy, right? That's why we're so concerned about Taiwan, right? And then this issue of this, I think probably Jude has more to say about that. This return to Mao Zedong, right? That this the use of ideology, right? Maybe also even the ancient Chinese culture as sort of another, right, alternative legitimacy source. So I think there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of this profound implications of the A4 revolution.
Thanks a lot, Yan Zhong, and I'd love to try to dive into some of these things. I mean, I'm sort of seeing two, areas for further consideration and hard thinking. The eyes and ears that Jude mentioned earlier. One, I think does concern the movement. The societal elements and how things have changed there and how it gets manifested going forward. The other maybe is more an elite politics question. And that is some of the things you've just mentioned, Yan Zhong. I mean, how is this going to affect matters of legitimacy or efforts to generate, new mandates or new forms of legitimacy by the party, both to affect its domestic audience, but I think as well affecting China's reputation internationally. And so maybe we can get into a couple of these issues. And to start with you, Lynette, on that first element, you coined this as a movement, and you think it's important for us to think of it in those terms. A year on now, where do we look? Where should our eyes and ears be to try and make sense of this movement, to understand its momentum, to understand how it's being expressed, both in China and externally?
That's a great question, and I agree with my fellow panelists here. These are cracks on the society. I think it's the first sign of cracks, of significant cracks. And I like to think about the white paper protest and the sudden reversal of the zero COVID policies as the great leap forward during Mao's years. Right, it was the biggest policy mistake, but then Mao continued to rule China for another few decades. But the point is that was the very first policy mistake, then shake the cohesion among the elite. People start to question him, even though we couldn't see much signs of it until it became very obvious. This is how I would think about it. But in the absence of election or public opinion poll, how do we actually tell that people are starting to lose faith in the system, or the legitimacy of the party is actually eroding? So we can think about it as, Herchman talks about exit, voice, and loyalty. Voice, the people have taken their grievances to the street to make their voices heard in China as well as abroad. And there's also increasing sign of people exiting the system. You have Chinese people looking to migrate overseas. That has increased since the pandemic. The number of Chinese companies moving their capital to safer havens abroad, such as Singapore being an obvious benefactor. So we have seen both evidence of voice and exit. Again, I'm not saying that the regime will collapse anytime soon, but there's, I think, evidence to suggest that the party's grip on society is really, I think, not as strong as it was just a couple of years ago, before the pandemic. And I think much of it is due to Xi Jinping's own doing, his over-centralization of power. So when things go wrong, all the blame that would go to him and to the central government. So it used to be the case that there's always a gap between central and local governments. When things go wrong, people would blame it on the local government and then would attribute good things to the central government. But Xi Jinping, I think, has hang on to the zero COVID policy so tightly that he couldn't, push the responsibility and then shift it to someone else. So he is actually he has suffered from the very success of his own policies early on.
Lynette, do you have maybe a few, I don't know, either personal experiences or anecdotes or conversations you've been able to have with younger people, Chinese, that reinforces this thesis of yours that this is a kind of political awakening moment, that there's a political opportunity for greater activism. I presume this was mostly reflected overseas amongst Chinese student diaspora, but maybe you've also had similar conversations with folks who are in China today. I'd just be interested to, hear some further insights on what you're seeing there among young people, particularly.
Yeah, I've had conversation with Chinese students abroad among the Chinese diaspora. Some of them my students. I've had conversation with Chinese people in China as well as Chinese students in elite universities in China. I think the first sign of of political awakening was the abolition of the term limit several years ago by Xi Jinping. I think to many people, to the intellectuals, that was a sign of Xi Jinping's obvious attempt to hang on to power for as long as possible, and that reinforced by a whole range of other things, and the latest by white paper protests, I think is a political awakening in many sense of the word, and I do not want to exaggerate its implications, because it would take, I think, a long time, as Jude and Yanzhong mentioned earlier, for that dynamics to play out. But to me, that is the first sign of crack or weakening of the state's grip on society.
Thanks for that. Just to turn it, Jude, over to sort of more of the elite political level, Yanzhong noted that if the former social contract has eroded or is no longer in place, or is really facing headwinds, then what are you seeing in terms of alternatives for the party now to reinforce its legitimacy, not simply through coercive methods of the security state and propaganda state, but other sort of softer, if that's the right word, sources for party legitimacy, like ideology, like nationalism, like populism. Are you following this closely, and is it working in your view?
If you look at the main pillars of Xi Jinping's policy priorities, I think it's clear to me that they have not given up on this social contract, even if, as external analysts, we think that it is eroding. And in the 19th Party Congress in 2017, of course, Xi Jinping, in that report to the Party Congress, indicated that the principal contradiction had changed from essentially, growth production and maximization to the quality of growth. And I think explicit in that was a recognition that the expectations of Chinese society were getting higher, right? It was no longer just about, producing widgets in a factory. It was just no longer about sort of aggregate growth. It was, what's the quality of our healthcare? What's healthcare accessibility? Quality of water, food safety, environmental safety. Xi Jinping clearly talks a lot about these. He talks about ecological civilization, right? He now talks about the quality, better quality growth. I think the challenge is, and to connect this with some of both Yanzhong and Lynette's comments, if that is the priority list on paper, the implementation of it is not remotely sufficient to meet the rising expectations that exist. And in fact, as Lynette was just saying, I think the structure of the political system under Xi Jinping is creating so many pathologies in the system that even if Xi Jinping was really focused on this agenda, I think it's incredibly hard to implement because of all of the bureaucratic challenges that we see, both in terms of morale in the system, local government finances, which are a train wreck, which means just functionally, it's not a technocratic, or so it's not an in the weeds issue. It means, can you pay local government officials? And if you can't, which is increasingly the case, that local governments are struggling to basically make payroll, then you're going to have massive morale issues in the system. And as Xi Jinping knows, the sky is high, the emperor is far away. His ability to sort of drive and push through a policy agenda is limited if you don't have a full apparatus that is on board. So to try to answer your question, Bates, I think Beijing still feels like it is on the path to maintaining that social contract, as evidenced by the priorities you see in the Party Congress reports, in the 14th five-year plan, et cetera, but they're not delivering it. The political system under Xi Jinping is creating pathologies. And then final thought is, I think the geopolitical environment is inevitably going to create a tractor beam pull of nationalism. That, I think the Chinese leadership will find it helpful to really frame this as Xi Jinping said in March at the NPC, the West, the United States and its allies are encircling, containing, and suppressing China. Comrades, this is a hostile world. The West is out to get us. It's time to batten down the hatches, dig in our heels. It's an us against them. I think they're still trying to balance that with a social agenda. But I think as we move on, I would expect to see that much more full-throated nationalist articulation to become much more evident.
I'd like to get back to that, Jude, and everyone can prepare in the back of their minds, because I do want to ask the question about what do the white paper movement and the lifting of zero COVID a year ago now mean for China's international reputation and how it's going to attempt to navigate its international relationships going forward. But before that, Jude has sparked in my mind a question I want to have for you, Yanzhong, because I think our viewership is not going to be as familiar probably as you certainly, but and some of us about the healthcare system in China. I mean, what explains this problem? I mean, China is a high middle income country. It's on the verge of potentially becoming a lower high income country. That's certainly their aim. Technological miracles, fantastic cities, remarkable infrastructure, all the rest. But their healthcare system is awful. Why is that? What explains this? And what are some of the challenges for this system going forward to meet the kind of needs that Xi Jinping says the party should be trying to meet in terms of people's expectations? Health is number one in the minds of everyone, and yet that expectation falls far, far short of what would be hoped for. And why is that?
That's a great question. I think when we talk about the health care, public health issues, basically we're talking two types of issues, right? The first is ability, right, to cope with a potential disease outbreak, right? That we thought that they fixed that problem, after at least significantly improved by the healthcare system's capability to address a potential disease outbreak like SARS. That after 2002, 2003, right, there's much change, right, in terms of fixing that system. But we were apparently overly optimistic about its capabilities. That before the COVID-19 hit, right, the Wuhan clearly showed, right, the lack of the morale, the fragility of the healthcare system in dealing with a major disease outbreak, especially when talking about dealing with a novel pathogen, like SARS-CoV-2, right? The lack of transparency, right? The ineffectiveness, inaction continue to be a problem in the system, and I'm a little bit concerned that now, when the acute stage of the pandemic is over, there's a lack of adequate discussion, right, on the political aspect of the problem. We talk about lack of transparency. We talk about the lack of local state capacity this problem continued to be there. In fact, the government has, is actually considering revising the infectious disease law. But if you look at the revision draft, much of the problem, continue to be a concern, because even though the focus is on the disease surveillance response capacity, but for example, they would reward whistleblowers, but they still say, well, you cannot publicize information officially through social media. You have to go through a government sanctioned channels, right? Your local government continue to have the authority to decide how to respond to the outbreak without the prior authorization from the up-level governments. Right? They have to be still the only official source, official organization to issue any disease-related information. So many of the problems continue to be there. Right. So, that, sort of raised the concerns whether, if another disease outbreak hit China now, how they're going to respond, right? Whether the pattern will be the same. In fact, the WHO's recent, this request to China asking for clarification of this, the undiagnosed clustered, the pediatric respiratory disease outbreak in China is also a sign. This is sort of a lack of confidence, right? In the transparency, right, in this system. And the second type of system is to talk about the healthcare system, right? The ability, right, to sort of provide adequate healthcare to 1.4 billion people, right? I just saw the other day by the government issued data on the people who are covered by the healthcare insurance schemes. Even though they still claim 95% of the population are covered, but there's something that I found alarming in that they now saw a drop of 17 million people from the system. The government explained this basically as the elimination of the redundancy of people being covered by different kind of schemes, but many people, the healthcare experts would agree that it has to do more with the rising premium that people, especially the rural people, find difficult to pay. Right? I guess the local fiscal revenue base being undermined by the weak economy. And the governments continue to provide subsidies to the system, but the subsidies, that if you talk about the people out of the pocket payment, right, continue to increase, and the healthcare costs continue to increase. Right, the 2021 they didn't provide data of 2022, but 2021 the inpatient healthcare costs increased by 6.3%. So, all this, I think, again, that sort of undermine that social contract, right, in China, right, that we saw the protests already, right, Wuhan and Dalian, right, those retired workers, protesting against the government efforts to curtail the benefits associated with the system, right?
Mm-hmm. So this is interesting. So you've got the pathologies, to use a medical term, of the system politically, undermining its ability to be effective, coupled with, as you say, continued sort of just basic pragmatic and technological difficulties in extending care to such an enormous population, especially to those who are not as well off and cannot really afford to pay into the system in order to receive that care. I want to do one more round of questioning and just open up the lens again to sort of the international. And we'll wrap up on that. Starting with you, Yanzhong, and then over to Jude and Lynette have the last word. In your travels around the world now, in your communications with folks who are also, watching what's going on in China, what is your takeaway in terms of China's sort of international reputation, if you will, as a result of what we saw a year ago, and how things have been handled since? Yanzhong, do you think it's had an overall negative impact or neutral, or is China still being successful sort of at building its brand internationally?
Well, I think that's a great question. In fact, if you look at the pure survey, right, clearly, right, we saw the international reputation, right, suffered, right, because of the Chinese response, to the pandemic, including, right, the A4 revolution, because initially, right, they were talking about the superiority of the political system, right, using its, effect to respond to the pandemic as sort of example, to showcase the superiority of the system. But after this A4 revolution, right, the complete abandon of the this zero COVID approach, and they embrace approach they previously mocked, right, laughed at, that completely, right, is, sort of unravel the whole myth about this authoritarian superiority. So that is a big hit, right? This real setback for their soft power, right? In the meantime, right, if you talk about, right, this vaccine diplomacy, right, mask diplomacy, again, right, that was in part is, China tried to use this, sort of initial, comparative success, right, responding to the pandemic to project its soft power, right, to provide the so-called global public goods, right, to improve its international reputation. That did help, right, initially. Right, we saw there's data, right, the poll data suggested, right, that there's improvement of the Chinese international image. But again, right, that with this clear diminishing returns problem of the zero COVID policy, with the lack of effectiveness of the Chinese vaccines, dealing with the Omicron variant, that the popularity, right, of the Chinese vaccine also, right, that we saw the actual significant drop. Actually, that began in the fall of 2021, but essentially after January, 2022, the global delivery of the Chinese vaccine dropped it to the lowest level because it's, even like the lower middle income countries no longer welcome the Chinese vaccines. So there was a clear, right, the setback, right, in Chinese efforts to project a soft power. That in terms of its domestic response model and in terms of the sort of eventual failure of the vaccine diplomacy. But that being said, I did see variations, right? Developed countries, I think, that the international image clearly suffered, right? Look at this percentage of people who held negative opinions on China reached to the unprecedented level. More than 2/3, right, held negative attitudes toward China. But if you look at many of the developing countries, I think we don't have systematic data to show that, but my impression is that China still, right, I think has in terms of soft power, in terms of the international reputation, I think that has not suffered much in that part of the world.
Yeah, I think we should have some strong expectations that China will be doubling down in its investments diplomatically, financially, and otherwise in the, let's call it the global South going forward. But I'm still interested to get your take on this, Jude. A year on now, following the protests and the sort of debacle of their lockdown and its reversals, any reputational risk for China globally on these issues? Oh.
Sorry. Just getting used to using these platforms like Zoom, Bates. I would say this is a question that defies easy categorization. If you're sitting in Washington, D.C., you can convince yourself that China's global reputation has collapsed. If you're sitting in Indonesia, it's a vastly more complicated picture. And I think you feel the economic pull of China when you're in Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America, even if, as Yanzhong mentioned, clearly at the margin, China's reputation has deteriorated over the last year. I think we just should be careful about, by we, I mean us in Washington, D.C., by overestimating the decline. China is and will remain a vastly influential country on the international scene. Its economy is slowing, but it's slowing on a massive base. Belt and Road Initiative is shrinking, but remains an important strategic toolkit for China to use. Xi Jinping was just is in Vietnam, where they signed a strategic comprehensive partnership. So countries are still looking to improve their relationships with China. We just had the EU-China summit, of course, a few days ago. So folks are still going to Beijing. Xi Jinping is still traveling, but this is a different story. This is no longer one of the world looking at this country at a near vertical ascent, one that can provide you vast market access and riches. That story is gone, and I think we're in a new, much more complicated story of still a powerful country, but one that, and I'll end on this, I think the veneer of infallibility has been punctured. That was really always one of the strengths of the Communist Party, is this perception that, these people know how to run a country. They know how to run an economy. No matter the challenge they face, they can find another rabbit in the hat. I think those days are over, and we're beginning to see China come down to a normal, gravity is starting to pull it down from, the celestial heavens and down into the world, where I think people look at this as a country with opportunities, but increasingly a political system with vast, vast shortcomings.
Thanks for that, Jude. Great points. And turn it over to you, Lynette, to sum up. Any thoughts in relation to China's international reputation, or other reflections then on this conversation and what you're following on these issues in relation to China going forward?
Sure. So on the implication on China's international image, I think Yanzhong and Jude have mentioned most of the point that I wanted to talk about. I think the record is very mixed. At best, mixed and declining at worst. Very mixed. Some initial success with its mask and vaccine diplomacy at the beginning. But then there was also pushback because of quality issue and alternatives. And I think the record could be divided between, the reception in democracies such as Canada, United States, and Australia, and among the developing countries. I think in the developing countries, their reception of China and China's soft power, they may have, more traction than that is reflected in the Pew survey, which is conducted in democracies. And at least in democracies, we have seen an increase in anti-Asian sentiment, which many have attributed to the information control at the beginning of Wuhan outbreak. So, the whole Asian diaspora have also suffered because of the information control by the Chinese Communist regime. I think among the developing countries, the Belt and Road Initiative has also changed the way that it is trying to buy support internationally. What I could say and what I could see is, I think, China has realized that money no longer buys you love anymore, or not as easily anymore, right? Apart from using money to buy loyalty and support, you have to think about other things that go hand in hand with that. Is no longer one of, just throwing money at people and hoping that you become more popular. And we could see that also reflected domestically in terms of social contract between the party state and its people. If we could think about kind of two broad categories of strategies, that is carrot and stick. For a long time, since reform and opening in 1979, the party has used carrots in order to buy support, economic prosperity, economic development in its various forms, and then more recently, since Hu Jintao, is about income redistribution, paying increased rhetoric or at least lip service to people who have lost out from from 改革开放, from reform and opening. But all those things that carrots could buy you, the benefits are also depleting. Right? I think the party has realized that. So if carrots cannot reach as far as before, it's only logical that the party is actually handing out more sticks. And that is indeed what is happening over the last decade or so, with increased repression on civil society, crackdown in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and throughout China, and even COVID with the health code, with the help of digital technology. So that is reflected abroad. And I think, it's a mixture of carrot and sticks and rhetoric. Carrot, I think, is running its course, and China also doesn't have as much money to spend anymore. So increasingly, we are going to see a mixture of sticks as well as increased use of rhetoric or ideology.
Well, thanks very much, Lynette. All of these issues are so fascinating. It's going to make 2024 another wonderful year, I think, for all of us trying to dig in and understand better what's going on inside China and what it means for the world.